Wonderful. Let's go ahead and get started then. We have a lot to cover today and also a lot of ample space for dialogue with all of you. So let's go ahead and begin. Thank you again for joining this really exciting session on feminist informed policy analysis of policies inclusive of work with men and boys for gender justice. And we have the privilege now of being able to explore that from many contexts, from 9 national scorecards that were developed. And really looking forward to beginning to unpack the results of this process that we engaged in. Actually, I'll just give a quick context as we are beginning the session and introducing our speakers. And 2020, we began this incredible effort in partnership with colleagues at Femjust and MenEngage Alliance members in order to develop a nuanced methodological framework seeking to define promising practices and challenges in the design, development, implementation, and monitoring of intersectional feminist policy frameworks and processes, which are inclusive of a men and masculinities lens. And the goal of this effort has been to develop a rigorous evidence-based research to support members' advocacy at national, regional, and global levels by highlighting really what are opportunities and challenges in policy making around the world under this feminist informed analysis. And so today we're going to explore some of the overall findings alongside our speakers. So let's begin by introducing them. Thank you so much for the slide, Tom. So first and foremost, Neha Sood, principal at Femjust. Neha, welcome. Looking forward to chatting with you, as well as Linda Saleh, principal at Femjust as well. Welcome as well. Thanks for joining today. And Fidele, an executive director of RWAMREC, who's a MenEngage member and will be sharing experiences from engagement in the process from that angle. And Tricia, board member of CARIMAN, actually will not be able to join today, unfortunately. They're having quite a severe storm warning in Trinidad and Tobago, where she's joining us from. So just to let you all know, we'll adjust accordingly, but thank you for your patience on that. And of course, Joni Vanzant, Global Core Director of MenEngage Alliance, and I'll be facilitating the session. My name is Joni. It's a pleasure to be here. And maybe if we can put up the slide before we begin, we thought it would be great to learn a little bit more about you and what brought you to this session, especially as it relates to policymaking, a complex process that involves many stakeholders. We thought maybe we could do a quick check-in in terms of who you are, what stakeholder group you represent, why did you join the session? And maybe if you can just take a moment in the chat and share with us, your name and your location. And are you a policymaker, a civil society activist, UN staff, researcher? And why are you interested in learning about feminist informed policy analysis? Just take a moment to share with us. That would be wonderful to hear from you. Thank you for sharing. Seeing his colleagues are beginning to share, appreciative of that. Maybe we spend a minute or so, just seeing who's in the room. It's great to connect with all of you. We have Mahi there from Ethiopia, civil society activist and researcher. We have David from Bulgaria, Parents Association, coordinating the Men Care campaign in Bulgaria. We have Anthony Kidi, civil society from Lebanon. Thank you for joining. Valeria Saray from Bogota, Colombia, civil society. Thank you, colleagues, for sharing. Wonderful to have you here. Really appreciative of you joining. Wonderful. Great. So it sounds like many activists and consultants and researchers. I'm seeing Sini from Turkey, a UN intern, currently working with campaigns on engaging men and boys. Excellent. So I think this session, we hope, will be quite informative for you, especially all of you working on policy advocacy in some dimension or policy making. So thank you for sharing. Please continue to do so. Although we will now hand it over to Joni Vanzant, our co-director at MenEngage Alliance. Joni, it's wonderful to have you. Over to you for the context analysis of setting the stage of how we got here. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Jenny. Thanks so much for joining, everyone. It's really a pleasure for us to have you here. It's been, I think, quite a long-awaited moment that we're launching the policy scorecards. My name is Joni Vanzant. I'm co-director at the MenEngage Global Secretariat. So yeah, I have the pleasure to just share a couple of kind of background notes on how we came to develop these scorecards. I know we have about 4 slides that we would like to show. If somebody can help me put those up. They just serve as a little bit of background to what I'll be sharing. But I think what's important here is that we are launching these scorecards as part of our broader efforts to facilitate capacity building on how to do evidence-based advocacy, evidence-informed advocacy for, of course, policies that in some way, whether as a centerpiece or as kind of an additional piece to a broader picture, are integrating transforming patriarchal masculinities work and or engaging men and boys work. And we have developed as MenEngage Alliance collectively over the last couple of years a framework where we say it's super important that these policies are feminist informed, intersectional, human rights based, gender transformative, and that they center accountable practices. And I think especially those accountable practices are really what led us to develop these scorecards. So if we look at the context where we're living in at the moment, and I think many of you are experiencing this in your daily lives, in your work, there is a rising anti-feminist backlash wave at the national level, regionally, globally. And in many countries, we see increasing populism, whether it's right-wing or in some contexts, perhaps even left-wing informed. But it's backlash against already achieved and recognized rights of women, girls, LGBTQI people, and many other marginalized communities. And of course, just the recent overturning of Roe versus Wade in the United States by the Supreme Court put an end to 50 years of recognized rights, constitutional rights to safe abortion in the United States of America. And that's just one example of how I think that kind of organized backlash against women's rights, against human rights is showing up in policy spaces increasingly. And we know that many of you, whether you're based in the global north or in the majority world, whether you are a civil society activist or a policymaker yourself, are facing and constantly working against these anti-rights and anti-freedoms move. And that's why we know that we need to come together now more than ever, and we're working with that as MenEngage Alliance internally and with partners ongoingly. We need to come together as a progressive movement, including for policies and policy making that really uphold and advance women's LGBTQI marginalized people's rights and freedoms. And we know that this is equally important at the local level, where many of our members and partners work, as it is at the global level, where we're organizing a lot of our advocacy work as the MenEngage Global Secretariat. And just a small side note, when it comes to organized backlash, you may have seen this already, but just wanted to point out, we launched a paper recently with outcomes from the Ubuntu Symposium on backlash, how it shows up and what potentially responses are towards countering it. So if you haven't seen that yet, do check it out. Maybe one of my colleagues could share a link in the chat as well. But so going forward, and maybe if I can see the next slide here. as I said before, we've really centered accountable practices and the concept of accountable advocacy in the work that we're doing. And so we know that given the context that we're currently facing and that I just sketched, when it comes to men and masculinities work, and especially, or including rather, the policies that are made around that work, that it's always key that they ultimately contribute to the goal of women's rights and gender justice for all. And while that seems to be a given, we know that in practice, it's not always the case. So we do observe that there is kind of across the world an uptake in the number of governments that are incorporating work on men and masculinities, whether it's in existing or in new policies. And of course, we welcome the trend of that increased uptake, but it's also important that those policies are done right, that they're really contributing to women's rights and gender justice and those objectives, and that they do not lose sight of those objectives. And we even see that at worst, policies on men and masculinities can be used as a vehicle for anti-rights groups to center, for example, principles of the family over individual rights, or to center fatherhood over the rights of mothers and other carers. So of course, we want to prevent that any work on men and masculinities kind of taken up in ways that are actually harmful to the ultimate objectives that we have. So therefore, we say it's key that policies on men and masculinities, whether they center men and masculinities or they do work on masculinities in some part of the policy and the programming that flows from it, that this is feminist informed. So when we say accountable advocacy practices, they seek to connect with and respond to the concerns of feminist advocates. And by us adding our voices to challenge anti-feminist backlash, and by seeking to have the work on men and masculinities contributes to political intersectional feminist agendas that really centralize a gendered power analysis. And we seek that those advocating and contributing with expertise on men and masculinities, that they carry and that we carry out this work in responsible and accountable ways in policymaking spaces. And these have been some of the key foundational principles for our conceptualization of what we've been calling accountable advocacy. So just sketching this, we know why we need to have accountable and feminist informed intersectional policies on men and masculinities. But the question has also been for us, how? Now, over the last years, we have seen that actually quite a progress has been made when it comes to the global policy framework on men and masculinities. For example, in 2017, the Human Rights Council adopted Resolution 3510, which is about engaging men and boys in preventing and responding to violence against women and girls. And that lays out a super clear normative framework on feminist informed men and masculinities work. The OHCHR launched a report with promising practices in violence prevention response that even takes the step of setting out, well, some of the more practical operationalization of that normative framework. And the CEDAW committee has also shown increased interest in taking up critical work on men and masculinities. And we've organized some dialogues with them. So these policies all make it clear there's need for evidence-based recommendations with nuanced depth of assessment across an intersectional feminist political analysis, and to be accountable and inclusive, both in the contents of the policies, but also in the policy making process. Now, that leads us to the policy scorecards that we will be launching today. We really set out to answer the how question, and we initiated these policy scorecards to inform better policy making at all levels. And we really want to thank Neha, Sood, and Linda Saleh of Femjust for partnering with us in this initiative. It's really their feminist expertise and their experience that has informed the framework that we've developed. And we're super thankful to you that you have been partnering with us and that you are here with us today to share your insights and your wisdom. So in essence, the framework that we've developed to analyze policies, it doesn't only lay out the contents, but also the process of how they can be developed, how they are resourced, how they are implemented. Basically, the framework that we've developed lays out a blueprint for what adequate feminist-informed, accountable policies and programming on men and masculinities should, we think, look like. So that, I said it before, they really contribute to the end objectives of women's rights and gender justice for all. Now, we acknowledge that it's been quite ambitious and the framework is quite ambitious, and it's not easy to actually do this in reality. And for example, as you will hear today, even the highest score that we found across the cases that we've been looking at found a score of over 50%, so out of 100. So I think it's really important to keep in mind that the score that we're seeing is not a reflection of kind of the failure or the success of local advocacy work. It shows how challenging the contexts are that we work in, with so many stakeholders involved and working with those in power, governments and policymakers. And no matter how hard we work, we don't always get what we want. And for example, one thing that we really saw is that LGBTQI involvement has been a key challenge across the context, and a lot of work is still needing to be done there. So there's a lot to learn from the outcomes from this framework for all of us. And we really welcome also the speakers that are here with us today, sharing about their cases to reflect on this. And so the purpose why we did this in the first place is also capacity building for all of us. So what does a good feminist informed policy on men and masculinities actually look like? We didn't have an answer to that. We didn't have a reference frame, and now we do. And we have standards to hold governments accountable to. We acknowledged what is crucial now that we have a relatively strong global policy framework, so the one that I sketched from the United Nations, and given the experiences of regression and shrinking spaces in country, it's more important than ever that we support local country level policy making, and because after all, this is where we live our daily lives. And that's one of the contributions that we hope to make with this effort. So with that, I want to thank you again so much for joining. I'm really looking forward to listen and to be interacting with everybody. And back to you, Jenny, for the next step in the program.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Joni, for setting the stage. Exciting. So maybe we can delve into the how now. And I would like to invite my colleagues, Linda and Neha, to this section. We can have a roundtable dialogue on building the conceptual framework for a feminist informed analysis of policies inclusive of work with men and boys that can be either standalone or integrated within a broader policy framework. Welcome, colleagues. Thanks for joining.
Thanks, Jenny, for having us.
Absolutely. Maybe we can delve into what elements are necessary to consider building a feminist informed policy analysis framework for policies that include work with men and boys. Tom, maybe you can guide us to the next section. I think here we're seeking to unpack what makes policy gender transformative, Linda, do you want to guide us through the first point?
Yes, sure. Thanks, Jenny. And thank you again for having us. I'll speak for myself. I'm thrilled to be here and to really have supported MenEngage in this project. It is ambitious, there's no question about it, but I think the outcomes of it can be really good, and it can be a useful tool for activists and others at the country level. So one of the things, as noted on this slide right here, that we looked at when starting to consider what a gender transformative policy could look like, that was intersectional. It's an intersectional and it's feminist informed analysis, right? That's part of what makes it's the foundation of what makes a gender transformative policy. And for us, what that meant specifically is that we would consider a policy to be gender transformative if it aimed to dismantle harmful and oppressive social and gender norms, as a start, and not just to dismantle them, but also to create new norms that affirm people of all gender identities and expressions, and also sort of, it redistributes power and privilege, and it's not just concentrated in the same folks and characters that we see, it's traditionally been. And another aspect of what makes a policy gender transformative is that the problem that a policy is trying to address, or the issue a policy is trying to address, has been appropriately conceptualized. And I think we'll see later on, when we're going a bit more into the case studies, how sometimes that's not the case, right? And so when a problem is appropriately conceptualized, it would involve really identifying the power imbalances that are created by gender norms and stereotypes, and how these intersect with other forms of oppression. And importantly, a policy or other sort of governing document is gender transformative if it does not perpetuate existing gender norms and stereotypes in its framing, assumptions, or strategies. And this seems to be sort of, that it can be an obvious point, but we found, as we were, doing this research, the time and time again, we saw the leveraging of the very types of norms that a policy aims to, sought to dismantle. And also, what makes a policy gender transformative is that it really is using, human rights-based principles. And so there's a focus on participation, a focus on empowerment, on accountability, which Neha will be speaking about, on transparency, and also on centering those that are most affected by the issues within a policy, and those that are most marginalized, among others. So those are a few of the key sort of the cornerstones when we were thinking of what makes a policy gender transformative. In terms of bringing intersectional and feminist analysis, that's where we started. So I'll pass it on to Neha, I think, now.
Thank you so much, Linda. Yeah, just I think bouncing off of your last point there, of like, what does a human rights-based approach look like in policy making? Like, how can that be applied to the policy process? Linda already mentioned sort of the different principles around participation, around transparency, around accountability, and what that could look like in practice includes, I'll just share a couple of examples. So, for instance, in a policy process, from sort of like the first step of designing the policy all the way through to implementing it, monitoring and reviewing it, just making sure that there is that transparency, that there is information about that process that is accessible to, as Linda said, like those who would be most affected, like the key stakeholders, right, for that policy, which often is everyone, but then paying particular attention to those who may be marginalized and may not have ready access to that sort of process. I think in our view, sort of at its heart, a gender transformative policy is accountable to like those who have been most oppressed historically by patriarchal norms, gender-based discrimination, gender-based violence, and this includes not only women and girls, as can sort of often be conceptualized, but also trans, non-binary, queer communities. And so it's important for a policy to sort of recognize that and put that into practice. I think another sort of like key aspect that perhaps, isn't immediately sort of like evident to those sort of like conceptualizing a policy process can be the fact that, like the leadership of movements of these communities, so like feminist movements, queer movements, young people's movements, their leadership is critical to that policy process and every sort of like stage of it. It's important that these movements are engaged and engaged meaningfully, not just as a checkbox, sort of like checking the box sort of exercise, which, we've seen in most of our countries, region no bar, level of development no bar. So those are a couple of elements that I just wanted to highlight. Back to you, Jenny.
Thanks, colleagues. Yeah, maybe it's good to unpack a little bit your conceptualization around also addressing a socio-ecological frame, no? Which is quite important, I think, too, to from your assessment, to not just have an articulation of the roles and responsibilities of men and boys as individuals, but their contribution towards also policy, institutional, and systemic change. And we say this within the context, the broader context of feminist movements clearly calling out for feminist systems change. So in some ways, how does the policy seek to address on the entire spectrum of men and boys' roles and responsibilities towards transformation at all levels. So in some ways, a gender transformative policy engages men and boys, and it does so in service of the mission of achieving a gender just society, social and political institutions, and a just and equitable policy framework, And strategies to engage men and boys don't operate within a silo, but are part of a broader comprehensive strategic framework to achieve gender transformation at all levels, including systemic transformation. Wonderful.
Could I just sort of like speak to your point, Jenny, about the silos? I think that's among many other things that we mentioned in the past few minutes, that's such a key thing that it to be sort of alert to, right? I think one of the concerns of feminist movements has been that with this interest in policies and programs to engage men and boys, and sort of like then, we see this kind of like siloed focus on it and like taking away attention and resources then from, as you were saying, like the larger sort of response or larger policy and programmatic work around towards gender equality. So I think that's a really key point you make there.
Absolutely. I think once we go into unpacking the examples, it's great to highlight how this panned out in our real world context, fleshing out precisely these issues on funding and competition for resources. Yeah, thank you for raising that point. It's very important and wonderful. Maybe we can go on to the next section. If Tom, you don't mind putting up the slide, because in continuation to unpacking sort of the key elements of what a gender transformative policy really is, in a more nuanced view, how do we build a policy analysis based on an intersectional feminist approach, And I think one of the most innovative things, if I may say so, about the work that you carried out, Linda and Neha, is just the fact that we're using this intersectional feminist lens to evaluate the policy process from beginning to end, from the policy design, the development of policy content, the implementation, and the monitoring and evaluation of impact. This gives us a much more robust 360 view of how a policymaking process is either in alignment or not, right, with feminist informed analysis and practice at all stages. And so this yields a much more in-depth and nuanced assessment, that we can use both to assess a policy that's already in place, but really to begin to inform a policymaking process from the beginning, if we're we're already considering everything from beginning design to end stage monitoring and evaluation and adjusting the policy as it's being implemented and we're receiving results. And I just want to add one point, which I think is really important. It's these scorecards across these 4 dimensions, assessed a policy across these 4 dimensions. And they really hinge on a triangulation, a robust triangulation of data from both relevant policy documents, including reviewing government commitments and other national gender strategies, but also their commitments at regional and global level, like have they ratified CETA, for example. It also hinges on interviews and surveys of various stakeholders across all different policy making actors involved in the policy making, whether it's UN officials, civil society, government officials. And so it's really evaluating these 4 categories through a robust data collection process, which I think one point I want to highlight is in doing all that work of gathering that data, one thing that very naturally emerged from that process was just an organic historical and political context that allows us to situate what was happening when the policy emerged, which is highly influential, right? Sometimes there's the approach of look good on paper policy, where we're just assessing the content, but here we're taking even a historical view. What have been the struggles of feminist movements long-term within a context that even led us to the design of the policy, right? So even going back within that historical and political context really facilitates us contextualizing the policy we're discussing and how it fits into the broader trajectory of politics for gender justice within the country, So thank you for that. I find both of these really great innovations and the capacity for us to have a framework for how to analyze a policy, that is much more integral and holistic. Wonderful. And maybe we can support colleagues. What kinds of questions are we exploring in each of these policy cycles, to really unpack whether the policy design, content, implementation, and monitoring and evaluation were carried out in a feminist informed process? So yeah, maybe I think it might be helpful if we can share with colleagues, just a little bit about what are some of the things that we would think about in each of these sections,
Sure. Yeah, I can sort of get us started in talking about some of the questions we considered around policy design. And I'll share a couple of examples, but I'm sure many of the folks here these are the same questions that have gone through their mind, when they've been in the course of their own advocacy and activism. So I think you'll see things that are these questions that informed this analysis. What makes it robust is looking at the 4 components, right? Like the entire life cycle of the policy, and triangulating that data. But the specific questions that we looked at in each of these are things that I think everyone here can really relate to, because there are questions that have come up for you as well, I'm sure. So for example, under policy design, one of the questions that we had was around what's the subject of the analysis? Is this policy that we're looking at, is it a standalone policy on engaging men and boys? Or is it one aspect of, is it one section of a much broader policy? Whether that policy be, on gender equality writ large or a reproductive health and rights policy, whatever the case may be. Was that standalone, or was it part of a larger thing? And that goes back to the point that I made earlier, right, about how we conceptualize, how we're conceptualizing the problem, right? So that's one example. And then another question that we took into consideration were there sufficient consultations that were organized with civil society and groups that are represented, representing groups that are most affected by harmful gender norms, right? And so by harmful gender norms and stereotypes and patriarchal masculinities, i.e. were feminist groups involved, were groups for young people involved, were queer groups involved. And oftentimes what we saw is that, you know, if there was a sort of really participatory process that, you know, that included, you know, in-depth consultations, if the process was good, sometimes what was missing were the really big key players, right? And so that could be, we frequently saw that that queer, trans, gender, non-binary folks were excluded from you know, the policy design process. And that's problematic. You know, it's the same norms apply. The same norms that harm women and girls are harming, you know, LGBTQI folks. So that was something that we looked at. And, you know, beyond that, was there sufficient time in these consultations, right? Was it just, you know, a consultation that was open for a period of 2 days, wasn't translated into you know, languages, no opportunities for any other feedback at any other time? All of these sorts of questions that need to be considered when looking at the policy design, right? Policy design aspect. So those are just a couple of examples. Those are a couple of examples. There are many more, you know, that I'm sure we can all think of. But with that, maybe we can take a look at the policy content, some of the questions that we thought of during policy content reviews.
Thanks, Linda. That's really helpful in a way where were feminist and LGBTI groups tokenized in the process, right? It's like a key question that we explore through a broader analysis. Great. So for policy content, I think in some ways it's important to understand if the policy is taking into account, legally binding commitments such as CEDAW Convention or any other regional or sub-regional conventions. This includes Convention of Belém do Pará, Istanbul Convention, other non-binding agreements such as CSW outcomes, Beijing Platform for Action, resolutions of the Human Rights Council. We saw Joni present on Resolution 3510 that really lays out a strong framework for work to engagement in boys and violence prevention and response. Are these even referenced, right, or analyzed within the articulation of the policy? But also really important, regional strategies, EU gender strategy or SADC gender policy are some examples. Is it following any guidance from CEDAW, concluding observations, right? So is it building upon what has already been adopted, agreed upon normative framework at all levels, regional and global? This is important to understand if it's being informed, by, in some sense, the most progressive, cutting edge normative frame. I'll leave it at that in terms of policy content, just as one snippet of what we can begin to consider, and how we assess whether the content is robust or not. Yeah, maybe for policy implementation, do you want to share with us, Neha, your thoughts?
Oh, thanks, Jenny. Yeah, I think, again, for, policy implementation being like a pretty vast subject, there were a number of questions that arose for us when we sort of applied, like feminist analysis, human rights-based approach, and a socioeconomic, socio-ecological model. But some of the examples that I thought would be interesting for us to look at are sort of as a continuation of a point that Linda made. It's not enough to sort of engage feminist, queer, and youth movements in the design process. It's also important to sort of meaningfully collaborate, engage with these movements through the implementation process as well. these are, these groups, these movements are sort of like often closest to the ground, know the realities of communities really well, and can be very sort of like crucial partners in the policy implementation process. So that was sort of like a key question that we looked at, or thought it would be important for colleagues as well to look at. We thought, like, again, sort of more like, applying like a human rights lens, it was important to look at whether there were sort of sufficient, financial, technical resources that had been allocated for the policy implementation process. I think we found quite consistently, obviously not in every single case that when we applied these questions, but we found in several cases that, even when there was a robust design process and the policy content was really strong, where the process faltered was at the implementation stage, that not enough resources had been allocated, that like the expertise of grassroots groups and movements had not been sort of engaged for implementation, which would have really benefited the process, and there wasn't sort of collaboration with these groups and movements in a way that would really sort of like advance policy implementation. So these are like some of the questions we looked at, and then what we saw, and so that would be like, in our view, I think important for colleagues to keep in mind when they're sort of looking at a policy process. I think, if I may just sort of like tag on a little bit of a discussion about the policy monitoring and evaluation process, which is so sort of like closely tied in with implementation. Again, sort of very like, like the same sort of principles apply to every stage of the process, right? So it was like, we think it's important to question whether, first of all, whether a monitoring and evaluation sort of like strategy and plan were in place at all. I think that's such a critical aspect of accountability, a critical aspect of a human rights-based approach is like being evaluative, having a focus on learning, and not in a way of like being critical, but rather like being constructive, right? Like constructive accountability or like a constructive monitoring and evaluation process can lead to like course correction, to reviewing things, reforming things like policies or programs. So it's so important to have, first of all, that that approach, that mindset, that approach towards monitoring and evaluation and learning and review. So in keeping with that, just sort of applying some of the same principles, it's really critical that a monitoring process or an evaluation process isn't removed from the inputs of like the communities that the policy is meant to benefit, the groups and movements that serve those communities and are sort of closest to them. Like, it shouldn't be a process that's kind of like done quietly by like policymaker or like government or like external sort of consultants. It should really like engage communities and movements. And similarly, like in order to do like have a strong monitoring and evaluation process, it's important to have or bring about sufficient sort of like financial, technical resources, human resources to do that. Really prioritize this aspect of the process.
Thank you so much. That's extremely helpful to unpack Maybe Tom, can you put up the next slide? I was thinking maybe it would be helpful for colleagues to see, one example of a scorecard and how all of this gets scored. We've asked and posed some questions. As colleagues have shared, there's many more. There's a framework through which we can begin to unpack these questions across all of the 4 stages of the policy process. But as we're launching all of the scorecards and one case study, which is Canada, because we can't arrive at a score because actually it was just the consultation, the preparatory process for the policy development. So it hadn't been implemented yet. So just to share with you, there's 8 scorecards and 1 case study. As we're launching them today, maybe it's helpful to see then how all of this arrives at a score when we have assessed these complex questions across the entire policy process. And we use Sri Lanka as an example. Tom, if you can guide us to the next slide. And so as you can see here, it's quite small, but color coded. We have policy development, content, implementation, and monitoring and evaluation. And each of these lines are these complex questions we've just been unpacking. Were LGBTIQ and feminist movements involved, right, in consultations from the beginning, and then scoring on a scoring of 20 scoring criteria, all the way across this entire policy cycle and through a complex process, of triangulating this information, arriving at a score of 55% for Sri Lanka. So just wanted to share this with you. And as we end the session today, we'll be exploring a little bit more of how to carry out your own policy analysis and how to do so in a sort of light version and then a more methodologically rigorous process. Just a taste, because we would need quite some time to unpack that further, Wonderful. So I'm just thinking, as we're running a bit short on time, maybe it's good to bring in Fidele, and then we can hear some real world examples from Rwanda and the engagement in Fidele's engagement, in policy advocacy within that national context. And then we can come back and share some experiences with you, or some lessons learned, shall I say, across all of the policy scorecards. And what did we learn? What are common threads that were pulled across the learnings of that process in 9 different contexts? Fidele, welcome. It's so wonderful to have you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Joni. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. I'm honored to be part of this discussion, which I find as a learning opportunity, but also a capacity building. So hopefully we are going to use this scorecard to analyze other policies in our countries. So first of all, I would like to start by saying that I was surprised to see the Rwanda scorecard policy for 58%, knowing how Rwanda is a progressive country in terms of engaging men in gender equality and violence prevention. But again, at the same time, when I read and reviewed the 4 aspects which have been analyzed and how they are aligned to the intersectional feminist analysis, the human rights-based approach, and the socio-ecological model, I really found that the analysis was objective, and our policy actually had some gaps. So now, in terms of the policy design, the development process for the national policy against GBV in Rwanda has been highly consultative in nature, because the policy has been developed by actually a technical team led by the Ministry of Gender and Family Promotion, together with other key government ministries, including like the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Local Government, the Ministry of Finance, and gender machineries, including the Gender Monitoring Office, the National Women's Council, the Rwanda Parliamentarian Women Forum, and together with a team of consultants. So this team of consultants has held actually extensive consultations with both national and district level stakeholders, including civil society organizations like women's rights organizations, practitioners, and survivors of gender-based violence. So the policy has been discussed in large-scale consultation sessions, which brought together many stakeholders, and there was a pre-validation workshop, and a validation workshop as well. So before the policy could be submitted to the cabinet for approval, many stakeholders have been given opportunity to give inputs. So another highlight of the policy is that the policy is well aligned to the comprehensive gender equality framework that draws on other national laws, policies, like the gender policy, but also other conventions or agreements like the CEDAW, the Maputo Protocol, and many other framework at national, but also regional and international level. So some gaps of the policy in terms of design include the non-involvement of non-registered organizations, non-legal organizations, or informal networks which were not involved in the policy design, but also the LGBTQI movements have not been involved in the policy design. And that's why I would say that our policy design has not really been inclusive. So in terms of policy content, the content of the policy is actually generally strong because it includes, it includes the policy actions that disrupt harmful gender norms through sexuality education, and it challenges also gender-based violence in the private and public spheres. So the whole content of the policy actually is aligned to the, to the human rights-based approach. And I find this as one good aspect of the policy. And again, understanding of inequality has been a problem due to limited capacity of human rights, of human resources, and the lack of expert in gender equality. So the policy content was good, the policy design was good, but now the issue comes on implementation of the policy. So the effectiveness of the implementation of the policy is the most challenging issue due to the lack of sufficient budget allocation to gender-based violence, limited human resources, and weak coordination of the implementation. So in terms of weak coordination, you would find that, for instance, many stakeholders are implementing same thing in the same place and at the same time. So the coordination was really a challenge, but at the same time, it is now still a problem now. So again, it's not easy for a non-registered organization or an informal organization or an informal network, like even LGBTQ movements, to implement the policy, because it is not easy. So they have not been included in the implementation of the policy. So that's why I say that our GBV policy is really not inclusive. So in terms of monitoring and evaluation, so the scorecard shows that the MNE is the weakest part of the policy, because the MNE has been, the MNE strategy has been developed, but again, it is not done at all levels. For instance, when you look at the institutions which are responsible for the MNE, you will find the Gender Monitoring Office, and there have been no report on MNE of the policy. So no single report has been developed in terms of monitoring of the policy. And surprisingly, other policies, other strategies, other like the UN Resolution 1325, the Beijing Platform for Action have been evaluated. We have a report, MNE report for their implementation. But when it comes to the national policy against GBV, so it has not been evaluated. You will find no single report about its implementation, of course, due to limited budget allocation to the monitoring and evaluation. So again, the feminist organizations have been involved in the MNE, but not all of them. And informal networks, LGBTQ have not been part of the MNE. So briefly, the MNE has not been done effectively due to limited budget allocation to the MNE component. So of course, civil society organizations, we have raised some concerns about the policy that we have advocated with the Ministry of Gender, requesting to revise the GBV policy of 2011. And fortunately, our voice have been heard. So the 2011 policy has been revised, and we have been providing our input. So now the 2011 policy has been revised. It has been submitted to the cabinet for approval. And once it is approved, again, we shall use this scorecard to analyze the new or the revised GBV policy to find out whether it is transformative, whether it is inclusive, and to find out whether our inputs have been considered, because sometimes you give your input, but at the end you find that your input have not been considered. So thank you very much for your attention.
Fidele, thank you so much for sharing and your analysis too of both the process and sharing a bit about your participation directly, as a civil society organization, RWAMREC, within the broader context of the policy development. And I think it's important to note, this was very much the case in Costa Rica, in Mexico. Sometimes these policy processes are multi-decade efforts too, right? So in some ways, it's important to note the policy process is long and complex. Sometimes civil society organizations are advocating over many years. And so to really think, if we're taking a comprehensive and holistic and integral look throughout all of the policy cycles, as you mentioned, some of the gaps now in the implementation and monitoring and evaluation, how these can go on, right, into many years of ongoing advocacy work from civil society organizations. Just thank you very much for being willing to join and to share. And yeah, I'm just cognizant of time. I thought maybe it's helpful to do just a very quick round of the actual findings across all of the scorecards. I don't know, Linda and Neha, if you might want to join me and maybe we take 1 minute to go through what did we find across all of the scorecards. We just heard about some insight from Fidele and from the particular case in Rwanda. And unfortunately, if we had more time, it would be great to really unpack how this played out, no, across all contexts. But perhaps here we can just give a really high level overview of what were the common threads that Linda and Neha found as they were developing these scorecards, no? And I see my colleagues have begun to share all of the scorecards in the chat box. You can definitely go in and assess this a little bit more in depth, no? Should you have the interest. But here we'll just do a quick round and maybe we can just go in rotation, no? And actually here, just a quick glance at all the scorecards that were developed and the scores ranging from the policy process that had the most gaps, which we had Czech Republic and Turkey, all the way through the most robust policy analysis, which was Costa Rica at 64%. Thanks, Tom. And maybe we move on to the next slide. Great. Maybe I'll begin and then pass it over, or Neha, go ahead if you want.
I'm happy to. Thank you so much, Jenny. I think the first couple of points that I'd want to highlight is the fact that there isn't consistency across the policy process in most of the cases that we looked at. In a country, the policy design process can be really strong. And we saw a scorecard from Sri Lanka. We saw the scorecard from Rwanda. We saw that like some elements of the process like scored really high, were very strong, but then others, kind of faltered a little bit. I'd mentioned earlier that often like implementation would be sort of like a weaker link in the policy process. I think consistently we found that MNE, monitoring and evaluation, was often the weakest link. So there isn't a sort of like consistency in the application of feminist and human rights-based approaches at every stage of the policy process. I think this leads us into the second point. So on the next slide, which is if we look, if we talk specifically about engagement and like meaningful engagement of key stakeholders, which is something as as movements, as civil society, we're particularly sort of interested in. Again, we saw that there was stakeholder engagement in some, like at least one aspect of the policy process, some or the other, so in some countries, there was a more consistent focus on stakeholder engagement in the different stages. In others, maybe it was strong at the design stage, but not so strong in the implementation and M&E stage. And I think like sort of one example that I would sort of highlight there is around Sri Lanka. They had a very strong stakeholder engagement in the design process. In fact, it used it was sort of like a multi-pronged approach. It used like the government machinery, sort of like at the district levels and going down to the block levels, and then also sort of like engagement of civil society sort of partners, in that process. So we did see some really good examples of this. I think if we could move on to the next slide, the sort of the last point that I'll share, and then I'll pass it over, is something that we've mentioned earlier, and Fidele also highlighted this, that first of all, like we know, we've discussed that like stakeholder engagement, could be a bit inconsistent or spotty, but then even within that, the engagement of queer communities, queer movements was, disturbingly, it was sort of quite consistently low. The exclusion of queer movements and communities was quite a concerning sort of like finding for us, not surprising, but still sort of concerning, and something that needs to change. We know that in some instances, national contexts are quite severe. So for instance, around like criminalization, but even where there isn't that criminalization in the legal and policy framework, there was a general sort of like exclusion of queer communities. And it's both sort of around, issues of homophobia and transphobia and sort of not really, serving queer communities consistently. But there's also an element of not understanding that like issues of gender inequality, like we mentioned earlier, go beyond affecting women and girls, and also affect or oppress sort of non-binary and queer communities. So that was another sort of dimension to this exclusion.
Thanks, Neha. And I'll just pick up where Neha left off. One of our key findings also was that there's a wide range of approaches and strategies used when we were looking at the different countries. And many did focus, focused on power imbalances and challenging harmful norms and behaviors, which was great news, right, for policy design process. So for example, I'll use Sri Lanka as an example again. The policy, so they've got their policy framework and national plan of action to address SGBV. It really places priority on attitudinal changes, promoting positive gender relations, challenging stereotypes, and engaging men and boys to denounce SGBV and holding perpetrators to account. But not all strategies address power imbalances and harmful norms in the same way. So for example, we've got, in Indonesia, the policy actually, policy around GBV really focuses on, it emphasizes behavior change rather to improve health outcomes rather than transforming gender and social norms to improve the overall status of women, right? And given that Indonesia has long had one of the, it's had among the highest rates of maternal mortality in Southeast Asia, it's really important that we're looking at the bigger picture, not just the behavior change, but the bigger picture of transforming gender and social norms. And so what we see actually in that particular policy is actually a reinforcing of patriarchal, heteronormative patriarchal frameworks that focus on marital relationships and targeting husbands in their role as primary decision makers within the family. So it sort of reinforces the very norms that we're trying to dismantle at the cost of not really uplifting gender equality principles and dealing or treating abortion with the sort of the touch that it needs, so empowerment of women and transforming of gender norms. Another key finding, if we can move on to the next slide, thank you, is that in some cases we see that there are gender transformative as well as regressive tactics that sit within the exact same policy. So it's a bit of cognitive dissonance there, right? Because on the one hand, they're doing exactly, the things that activists at the ground in these countries are saying are needed and that we know are needed. But on the other hand, you've got these sort of this combating force which is, regressive tactics. And an example here is around, the Istanbul Convention. So for example, in Turkey, they have a policy that looks pretty good on paper, but we know from activists that on the ground, the government actually has proposed to withdraw from the Istanbul Convention and actually did so. They completed that, so they're no longer party to the Istanbul Convention. And so, I mean, that's an example of good on one hand and disturbing on the other hand. And this, with respect to the Istanbul Convention, we also see that in the Czech Republic, where there's certainly the challenge around sort of like gender and gender ideology around the world, the pushback against gender. We see that in the Czech Republic as well. It also implicates they have not yet ratified or signed on to the to the Istanbul Convention, and that is one of the sort of barriers, right? Is like this push against gender, and a concern that gender ideology and signing on to Istanbul Convention is really a way station to more feminist politics, more LGBTQ rights within the country. And really what they've been focusing on, the strategy that they have used, has been to interventions that have really focused on freeing women to participate in the labor market, right? So that's the kind of framing that is being elevated within that country. And there's more detail in that particular, in that case study. And then I'll move on to the final example, which is that limited financial resources and there's lack of clarity around financial resources, funding for policies on gender equality have been a really significant barrier. And we've spoken about that already, right? And so what it can actually do is, even if you have a really good policy without adequate financial resources, human resources, and real clarity about where the money is coming from and how it's been allocated, it can render even a really good policy toothless, right? If there's no capacity to implement, then that becomes a real challenge, right? For like progressing this agenda, this shared agenda, common agenda that we have of advancing gender equality. And so, for example, and I'll use an example of Mexico here, that they've got a national strategy that offers a really broad discussion of gender roles and stereotypes and an approach that transforms harmful norms across legislative and educational spheres. But there's been no specific budget that's been allocated to the national strategy. So implementation has been weak and unclear. And so many of the planned activities, including participation of men and boys and other strategies, have just not happened, right? And so they've just been overlooked. They've not been planned for because there's been no budget allocated to it. So that's one example of sort of the effect or the impact of lack of clarity and not assigning enough financial resources. Or in some cases, we see just a broad budget that's been allocated, right? But there's no line items. The line items, they've not been delineated for specific policies, right? So then it just becomes, again, something else that's a barrier to advancing these policies and having real movement on the ground. So that was, I think that was my key finding, and maybe I'll kick it off to Joni to carry us forward.
Thanks so much, colleagues. Tom, maybe you can move to the next slide, and our last finding, which has already been highlighted quite a bit throughout this session, is some of the gaps in all of the policies in terms of monitoring and evaluation, and just how critically important M&E is, no? You were mentioning, Neha, no? Just in some ways having that openness and curiosity to adjust the policy, no? But also as a key element to ensure accountability. And as you'll see in the scorecards, Czech Republic, no, was a good example of just continuing gaps, no, in the conceptualization and implementation of the monitoring and evaluation, where really it was a combination of a lack of political will and tools to hold governments accountable, no, for the implementation. And so in some ways, the monitoring and evaluation framework lacked, as you mentioned, Linda, any teeth, no, to hold the ministries to account for the implementation of the policy. One key finding was in Costa Rica, actually it was the only policy reviewed, which in addition to indicators and targets had baseline data against which to measure progress, which we know is super important for a monitoring and evaluation framework. So just to give you an idea, no, of how much work is still required in our policy advocacy and policy making processes to ensure that these last stages of the implementation and the circular ability to adjust the policy as data comes in is robust. Thank you so much for sharing. And as you can see, this was a lot of information, no, we threw at you. Thank you for your patience as we unpack some of this. And maybe we can open up to some questions at this point. We are running short of time, so maybe I can just indicate now we'll have about 5 to 10 minutes of Q&A. And if you would like to stay a little bit longer, although we're very respectful of your time commitment today, we'll just be sharing a little bit after the Q&A in terms of how you can carry out this policy analysis yourself, how to reach out to us. But feel free to also drop off if time is a constraint. Thank you so much. And maybe over to Jimena. Would you be able to indicate, no, if we have any questions in the chat that we might be able to pose to all of our panelists?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Jenny. Yes, please share your reflections or your questions in the chat box. We'll be checking it now, and yeah, feel free to share.
Thank you. I do see one question from Joni, I think, and Linda, go ahead. Or sorry, Neha.
Thanks, Jenny. Yeah, I thought I'd respond to Joni's question, and very briefly, because if Fidele is willing, I'd really love to hear his sort of like on the ground sort of experience and views. But you know, stepping outside of my role with this project of like doing the analytical work and just sort of speaking from broader movement experience, I think in regressive contexts where our movements are struggling to just sort of uphold, you know, like hold the line, or you know, as Joni puts it, trying to at least do something. I think I would just sort of connect it back to one of the points that Joni made initially, of the fact that like policy change, progress around policy can be a decades-long exercise, and you know, and it's up to movements to decide at different points in time what progress in that moment looks like for them, you know, and often progress can be incremental, as frustrating as that is, as much as we want, you know, to have the best possible policy and programs and governments and, you know, so on right now. We want all those things right now. The reality is often we have to like sort of make, you know, incremental progress towards it. So yeah, I'll stop with that and love to hear others' thoughts.
Neha, thank you so much. I'm just.
If you like, I could speak to Oswaldo's question as well.
Please go.
They ask about if we have recommendations to starting to use this toolkit in their countries. I mean, you know, again, like, you're the experts. The colleagues in countries are the experts, and you have like networks, you have collaborations, sort of, you have partners within your countries. I think, one of the recommendations that I would suggest is a collaborative process that it takes longer to embark on, to execute, but then the results are also richer, and it sets the ground for doing joint advocacy over a longer period of time. So yeah, that's like sort of one key recommendation that I would have is, please use the toolkit, all of the sort of substantive input that provides. But over and above that, just a strong recommendation to do it in a collaborative manner.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we've been grappling with how to begin to advance advocacy through movement building approaches, no? And actually that applies quite well to both of the questions that you addressed, both in regressive context. How do we really come together with broader movements, no, to make that assessment of how to hold the line sometimes, or what a win is, as well as how to carry out this process. Same conclusion in a way, no? There's the power with instead of power over. How do we come together and really through articulated movements, no, grow in our strength? And I'm seeing a question from Anthony. Linda, do you want to address that?
Sure. I mean, I can try, right? And I would again welcome others to jump in and sort of add on to what I'm saying. I think that's a really interesting question, Anthony, because we've seen just that, right? We've seen sort of various tools developed that then just sort of sit there and collect dust and are not sort of usable, right? I would say that, in order to prevent this just becoming yet another assessment tool, for me, if the real sort of the gold of it is in the methodology, actually, and the ability for, and this you'll see as Jenny sort of either I think at the end here or maybe in a future workshop, we'll sort of break it down, but it's the ability to use the methodology and specifically the questions to be considered under each of these, from the policy design through to the implementation phase, to be able to customize that and to make it really responsive to the particular situation that you are focusing. And so it will always, there's potential for it to always be relevant and always be responsive to the situation that one finds oneself in. So I think that's potentially one way to just keep it relevant and to use it. Just to use it as policy processes unfold. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe if I can build on that. As I was mentioning before, I just find one of the most innovative aspects, of the work that you carried out is how in doing this assessment once, right? You've already built this like historical and political context analysis, which is so rich, and these policy processes, as we've been unpacking, take such a long time. They're multi-year, if not multi-decade efforts. So in some ways, carrying out this robust assessment once already is laying a foundation of understanding of how stakeholders have been relating to a longer progression, right, of policy processes within a context. So I think one question that we had colleagues ask us in the last presentation that we had during the Ubuntu Symposium when we were beginning to finalize this process was, policy processes become outdated quickly. But again, by conducting this robust analysis once, you have all of the sort of foundational elements in place to adapt it, no, as the policy process unfolds. So just a quick addition to your point, Anthony.
If I could just add a very brief point there to what both of you have said, but building off of Jenny, your point specifically, like that, you know, the first time an analysis like this is conducted of any specific policy or policy process, it can form a baseline as well. And then if you sort of like repeat that process even annually or every few years, you don't have to do it all from scratch, right? Like you can just update the parts of your analysis that there have been developments with. And so, it doesn't need to be so daunting to think, oh, doing this repeatedly. But that can give, like, apart from having built like a historical record, it can then also sort of like create a record going forward.
Wonderful. Well, I'm cognizant for time. I'm not seeing any other questions. Maybe it's time to move on to our wrap up. Please do share if you have any additional questions in the chat box, and then we can address those in the last few minutes. But if not, Tom, maybe you can share screen again. And we'll just take about 5 more minutes if you have to drop off. Thank you again for joining. And I think here we just want to share a bit about how can you carry out this policy analysis, which I'm sure a lot of you are wondering, no? Thanks, Tom. And so we'll just do a quick overview. So today we are launching the 9 scorecards and also the analysis toolkit. So in some ways, you are able to go onto our advocacy webpage and explore all of these resources. The analysis toolkit is particularly intended to support you in carrying out this process. And as colleagues have been mentioning, just to note, this is a very brief introduction. And please let us know in the chat box if you would like to join a workshop to in a more in-depth manner unpack how to actually use this methodology, because we would be really happy to organize that with you. And the analysis toolkit, Tom, if you can go to the next slide. It really hinges on, as we were saying, the triangulation of key data, no? So not just if you are assessing, pardon, let me back up. You can use it for both assessing a policy that's already been implemented, but also to consider it can provide really good guidance as the policy making process begins. If a policy is already in ongoing, no? It's about the triangulation of key data, as we were saying, from both surveys, interviews with stakeholders across all sectors involved in the policymaking process, checking different documents in terms of, as we were saying, commitments or adherence or articulation and alignment with regional conventions and strategies, all the way to global normative frameworks. And so these annexes in some ways help you go through that entire methodological process. Again, let us know in the chat box if this is something that you might want to explore more in depth with us in a workshop. We would be really happy to organize that. And these annexes provide all of the key resources that you need to carry out the process. The methodological framework is all those questions that we ask, no, to really assess across the 20 criteria if the policy design, content, implementation, and monitoring and evaluation are done through a feminist informed frame. Annex B is the sample survey or interview questionnaire that you can use to ask key questions from all stakeholders in terms of the policy process. Of course, Linda and Neha supported us in doing that through an independent process. So in some ways, informants, no, participants were informants where the data was disguised, no, through that process. So they could be anonymous, which is also something to consider so that the process is robust. And Annex C is the scoring, no? So once we get all this data, we're triangulating this information. How do we really put it into the scoring to arrive at the rigorous score? As I mentioned, you can do this in a rigorous manner, which would be following all the annexes, or you can just use also Annex A for assessment, no, of like where your policy stands in a more light version, if you will. Please go ahead to the next slide, Tom. And it's one point, prior to that is the framework is really able to be adapted to also regional and global frameworks and policies, no? So it's just something to consider. It's not just for national level. If you have a regional policy, for example, that you would like to use this framework towards, it can be adapted by adjusting some of the questions, no, within the methodological framework. So it can be easily adapted to other levels. Thanks so much, Tom. Next slide. Yeah, let us know in the chat box if you would like to join a workshop. We'll keep a record and then reach out to you, no, in a future moment if that's something that would add value. Thanks so much. Next slide. Great, maybe over to Jimena. We just wanted to share in closing, no, some of the key resources in terms of advocacy. And thanks, Jimena. Jimena is our advocacy and knowledge management intern. So thank you for joining and has been doing quite a bit of work of organizing all of these tools and resources for them to be accessible to you, for them to facilitate and support, no, your incredible work at national level, as we've been highlighting in so many contexts, really complex advocacy work, no, sometimes within regressive contexts. So thank you for all the work that you do, and over to you, Jimena, to lead us through the resource sections.
Thank you, Jenny. Yes, we wanted to remind you that you can visit our advocacy webpage where you can find all the resources that we've been mentioning during the session. You can find in this webpage our policy scorecards in all 3 languages, which is Spanish, English, and French, as well as the policy analysis toolkit. We also have a webpage with the OHCHR report that we mentioned at the beginning, and a briefing document from MenEngage that you can download and review in the resources page as well. And yeah, we also included a section for a language mapping, that it's like a collection of different normative frameworks on the work with men in voice for gender justice. And lastly, we have a webpage for the CEDAW policy recommendations. The last resources I mentioned are available now in English, but during this week, we're gonna be updating the web pages and adding Spanish and French. So yes, please visit our advocacy webpage and find all the resources that we hope can facilitate your efforts in the advocacy work you do. Thank you.
Thanks, Jimena. Colleagues, thank you so much. I know we're about 13 minutes over time. I just want to pause to express my sincerest gratitude to Linda, to Neha for this incredible work. And thank you for your collaboration over these many years, and finally arriving to the launch with our colleagues so that we can share these resources. And thank you to Fidele as well. Thank you for sharing on your experience from national level. Really appreciative. And we look forward to the next steps. I'm seeing quite a bit of interest for a workshop, which would be wonderful. So we will go ahead and organize that and reach out to you so we can delve with some more time into the analysis packet. Thank you, colleagues. Really appreciative. so much information shared, no? And I think this really marks the beginning step for MenEngage Alliance and our ability to continue to inform our policy advocacy at all levels. So they are, it is in the aim, no, of the achievement of gender justice for all. So I pause there. Thank you.
Gracias, gracias. Un abrazo desde La Paz, Bolivia. Un gran aprendizaje. Con seguridad estamos más en contacto con cada una. Gracias, Linda. Gracias, Neha. Gracias, Fidele y Joni.
Ana, muchas gracias. Gracias por sumarte. Te lo apreciamos un montón. Un fuerte abrazo. Any last thoughts to share, colleagues?
Just deep appreciation for to the Global Secretariat for putting together such a interesting and informative and participatory event, and deep appreciation to all the participants for your engagement through the chat and the great questions. We hope this is a useful tool for all of you.
So thank you very much, Joni. As I said, this is a kind of capacity building, and we are planning actually to do the same for our Rwanda MenEngage Network members.
Thank you so much. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you for joining.